Hello and welcome back to the Godot community. My name is Sahira Dean. I'm the virtual PLC lead for high school 2D art. In today's webinar, I wanted to introduce you all to how I teach my students ink techniques. So at the beginning of the year, I always ask students to either purchase or make their own sketchbook. And of course, you can make this a class project if you wanted to, just making sketchbooks. Some years I've actually had them construct them out of cardboard or tag board and loose leaf paper and actually bind them together. But however you approach it, I definitely recommend encouraging your students to have access to a sketchbook. So in the sketchbook, what I have them do is, for this particular project, is to create their own value scale, and I have them do one for each ink technique. So stipple, scribble, hatching, cross hatching, and I think that's it. But I have them do one for each ink technique. So if you struggle like I do with teaching students how to use a ruler, I actually worked with one coworker who actually did a ruler test every year, which helped him. So I'm thinking about actually trying that one year. But nonetheless, the struggle with rulers definitely persists in my classroom. So I'm going to go ahead and measure out a 7 space value scale, and I'll have one for each technique, like I said before. All right, so I will need 4. So what I'm going to do is measure from the top, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'll go ahead and measure over to 7. And then I'll go ahead and section off. So I don't know if this is a tip, but I guess it is a tip. So with using rulers, I found that students struggle with not starting from 0. So I always ask them, I do take time in the beginning to ask students, where their 0 mark is, right? And then we kind of spend a little bit of time talking about, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, blah, blah, blah. And then a little bit of time talking about the half-inch spaces, the quarter-inch spaces, right? So I do that in the beginning. It does help a little bit. And then one thing, too, you can always have them to make 2 marks because you can better draw a straight line using 2 marks. So if I started with, for example, 1 inch down here, I could move my ruler over starting from the top, 1 inch down there, and I'm lining up those marks as opposed to eyeballing it. That does help some too. So what I'm going to do now is, starting from 0, I'll go ahead and, of course, mark off all my 1 inch spaces. So 1 at each big line and each big number. And then the next thing I'll do, of course, is just bring those all the way down. I'm sorry, unless I'm not in the camera. So this is also good practice for gridding, which for this particular project, I do introduce a grid. Drawing hands. We do spend time drawing, from direct observation, but ultimately they use the grid. All right, so stipple, of course, is using the dots, of course, which takes the longest, and this is just a regular ballpoint pen. I would honestly recommend just ballpoint pens in the beginning. Sharpies, they tend to be a little bit too dark, right? So the mark, like they can't really control them as well. I found ballpoint pens, you can easily kind of make marks lighter, you can make them darker. All right, so I just recommend a regular ballpoint pen, and students typically have that. So here, cross-hatching, so hatching, stipple, cross-hatching, and then scribble, okay? So I talked to them about, I demonstrate each technique on the side, And I'll talk to them about the more I overlap, the darker the value gets. And of course, at this point, they do understand that value is, the lightness or darkness of whatever medium you're using. Okay. And then, of course, the more white space that shows through, the lighter the value is, right? So they use this space to kind of practice. So hatching can go in any direction, right? The closer my lines get, the darker the value is. Okay, and this is my demo for them. And it's the same thing. You want to have 7 different values for each one. You want to talk about controlling your marks, right? So that way you can practice your craftsmanship and making something intentionally, either neat, clean, or messy, right? But you want to be able to control the marks you lay down, okay? I'll have, some really particular students go in with a ruler, to make all their lines really, really straight. I don't stress that. I think that's, just personality. I don't deter it either or discourage it either, right? So you get the idea with hatching. The closer the lines get, the darker the value is, and you want to keep those going in the same direction. Okay, so going all the way down to your darkest value. With scribble, students tend to get a little bit wild with this one, right? Just because, again, it's, scribble. But I try to, make sure they understand controlled scribble marks. That way they are staying in the space they want to be and not making too many stray marks in the other values. Okay, as much as it pains me to say stay inside of the lines, this is really good practice for, making something intentional. All right. So you want the white spaces or the level of white spaces to be pretty consistent going throughout the squares or the little space, each space, right? So meaning you don't want it to be like a lot of space up here and less space between down here. And also you don't want to have a white space around, just because that'll throw, or a lot of white space around the value, that'll throw the value off. Okay, so keep that in mind as you are teaching your students this particular exercise. All right, so now I'm going to go to the darkest value. And of course, again, this will have the least amount of white space. And again, you really want to stress controlled mark making. So slowing down as you get to the edges, making it consistent, not switching pens if you can avoid it. I had someone donate pens from an office one time, just a bunch of stray pens. So that could be an option, but it doesn't have to be an expensive pen. So I did want to say you do want to kind of go 2 by 2 in terms of determining if you need to go back and reevaluate. Okay, and then cross hatching will be the same thing. Now this first space technically is a highlight. You can intentionally leave that light, but you can also talk about, just having a few lines in that space as well. And then cross hatching. So I'm not going to start overlapping the lines necessarily until I need to get a little bit darker. Okay, but as soon as I cross, right, that would be your cross hatching. Okay, but cross hatching, of course, those lines can go in either direction. Okay, and of course those can get tighter together as I need to get darker. Okay, stipple, I tell them to be patient with. Of course, that takes the longest amount of time, right? So I tell them to kind of take breaks if they need to, come back to it. But the idea is, of course, the dots are getting closer and closer and closer together, showing less white space between to create those values. Okay, so the next step after they've completed all the value scales is to practice each technique using a form. Okay, so cone, sphere, cylinder, and you can have them draw this in pencil first, just because one goal and one thing they're going to want to do is come in and outline everything anyway. So you want to avoid that by having any hard lines left over. So indicate where your light source is coming from. And then you want to talk about, you know, intentionally laying in the marks and making your mistakes or working through your mistakes. So they're going to be nervous about working with pen because, of course, it is a permanent medium. But I mean, pen ink is pretty forgiving. Okay, they don't believe me when I say that at first, but honestly, it really is pretty forgiving because you can go in and make something darker. Of course, you can't remove marks, but you can work it enough to where it looks okay if you keep on working at it, right? And then you can even push this a little bit further and create a background, right? Which makes the edge of a form appear. As opposed to coming in with a harsh outline around the object. Okay, so I'm working in pretty controlled motion or movement, and I can see the edge of that object or that side coming forth a little bit. And there's a change of direction. You want to try to make sure your light source is still evident. I'll come in and add the shadow after I add the background. Or after I add the, the surface lighting, and then I can add cast shadow here. Okay, so in terms of introduction to ink techniques, they get a little bit more comfortable, gain a lot of confidence, after getting to this step, and they do it successfully, right? And then they see, oh, maybe it's not so bad. Okay, so they'll do that with each of these, and then that will count as a grade. So thank you for tuning in to part 1 of this webinar where we introduce ink techniques to students. In the next webinar, I'll show you the project that I did this year with students. We did hands. So I'll talk about the steps involved, and I'll show you some exemplars from that lesson. Again, my name is Sahira Dean. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's webinar. Please do join me on the Godot community where we can interact. You can ask questions. You can also interact with other teachers from around the state of Georgia as well. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, you guys.